Hey, I'm Rachel. A few years ago, I stepped away from my religious background. I had a lot of anger and a lot to say about evangelicalism and all the shitty parts of it. So I started a podcast to work through it and to feel less alone. A year into it, I asked my cousin in law to join the journey.
And I said yes. I'm Molly, co-host to the show. Turns out we had a lot more in common than just being in the same family. We were both raised in evangelical house churches in the 90s and 2000s. Talk about culty. We were homeschooled, culty, and we both left religion behind about 8 years ago.
So now we get together every other week and talk about the nitty-gritty that happens when you leave religion.
Everything from how to set healthy boundaries with religious family members, theology, hell, heaven, Paul, and how to recognize and heal from religious trauma.
This podcast is our healing process, and we're hopeful that sharing our stories, other people's stories, and what we learn along the way may help others heal too.
Religion leaves a mark on everyone it touches. Sometimes that mark isn't always positive.
Cheers to Leaving is the perfect podcast for anyone who's questioning their faith or looking to connect with others who have been there. You can find our show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. So grab a drink and join us as we say, cheers to leaving.
Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I'm super excited to be speaking today with David Moore. So welcome, David, to MindShift Podcast.
Great to be here, Clint. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited because I wanted to get the introduction out of the way because we have a mutual friend who introduced, I guess, you to me or me to you, I don't know, but Janice Selbie is a mutual friend, one of my favorite Canadians. So thank you, big thank you to Janice for putting you and I together.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, her work's amazing.
Yes, I love Janice. I've been on her court, I think it was 2020 and 2022, maybe it was 2021, 2022. I've done some presentations on that conference on religious trauma. In fact, we were in Vancouver the year that it was supposed to be the first one, but then COVID hit and it all got canceled, so it all went away. That was, I guess that would have been 2020. So yeah, we go back a long way. We actually
here we all were deconstructing, and then COVID hit, and now, then we were really deconstructing. It's like, okay, it just lit a fire to that whole process.
Yeah, it did. And weirdly, I'm sure we can talk about this, but I'm sure you know, I mean, the whole COVID pandemic, that just fast tracked all the conspiracy theories, the QAnon pandemic. So on
politically and culturally, it all came out of the woodwork right then.
Everything changed. Yeah. I wrote a paper for the Public Eye Journal, and it was all about how the pandemic changed the face of Christian homeschooling because they saw it as a great means to recruit non-Christians because they said, hey, you need to homeschool your kids because the schools are closed. We've got all the curriculum. Here you go. Only they didn't realize there was this huge dominionist Christian nationalist piece attached to it. So that's another fascinating angle I'm sure we could get into. Sure. Yeah, there was an agenda. And these people didn't know what they were buying. They were just thinking, oh, well, someone's just helpfully prepared all this curriculum, these wonderful people, and I'll just buy it and I'll teach my kids at home. Yeah. And all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, what's all this dominion theology? What? So yeah, that's a whole nother piece, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're coming from Lake Drive Books. So what's your sort of backstory? Are you, you said you're a publisher, an editor, you do things in terms of like ex-evangelical books and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I would say that I'm the owner and publisher of Lake Drive Books. I also run a literary agenting business. Sounds like too much, but for me, it's not. In this era of being a solopreneur and finding different revenue streams and exercising your skill set in different ways. It definitely works for me. In fact, they play off of each other quite nicely, being a literary agent, someone who helps shepherd authors to publishers, but also someone who publishes authors. And I learned from both sides of that. I've been in the publishing business almost 30 years. I didn't plan on it. It's often called the accidental profession. And how many of us are in a profession we planned on exactly? Or the
That's
thing that
true.
makes us money is not the thing we thought it would be.
It's true. Yeah. I was a pastor and we've done all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I thought I was going to be a psychotherapist early in the going. I was a psych major in college, but I couldn't get the religious studies bug out of me. And I wound up at a school where I did eventually get a PhD in religion and psychology, Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. It was more of a social science of religion, not a pastoral theology kind of psychology and religion degree. Although that was there, that was a component of it, but it was really more, how do you look at religion objectively? There are probably the biggest default stance on this is sociology of religion. You probably see statistics, research being done on the nuns, for example, on the political attitudes of evangelicals. Those are done by sociologists of religion. For me, I was more trained to look at the role of faith and how it interacts with our lives developmentally, psychologically, culturally. It was very formative time for me. It was very, very much a liberal theology education in a way. I put it that way because some people know what that phrase means, but it was really much more like socially progressive. There was a big focus on race, class, and gender, which was, something fresh for a 24-year-old white guy who just wanted to study psych and religion.
Yeah.
But I read some amazing books. I was introduced to some amazing authors. A good education can really make an impact on you, and it sure did on me. I wrote a dissertation on the what happens when you lose your faith, and how do you find your way forward. I used to say it's more like, how do you find your way back? But I don't worry so much about the finding your way back part. It's more like, how do you find your way forward? And I looked at it from the basic idea. The theory that I chose was, let's look at mourning theory. How do we mourn a loss in our lives? And let's talk about losing something like a religion. Well, it's one thing to lose somebody that you've loved all your life, for example, like a parent or a spouse. But how do you actually mourn the loss of religious symbols, religious community? I mean, that stuff is deep in your psychology.
Oh yeah, it's huge.
And it's like trying to mourn something that you can't, that's not as tangible. So it takes almost longer. If you wonder why people talk about their former religious lives incessantly, well, it's because it's near impossible to move on from a emotional, psychological point of view, but it is possible. But there's just so much to cover. You have no idea how much you were conditioned, and you were just saying that earlier when we were before this call, how, you're still 10 years later, it still very much shapes who you are. So that's my sort of educational background. But it was hard to find a job in academia for the kind of training I had. And it wasn't giving me licensure to be a psychotherapist necessarily. And it wasn't the most marketable degree from a religious studies point of view, which is a field dominated more by, Asian religious studies, sociology of religion, which I mentioned earlier, women's studies, African American studies.
It's a very niche thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Christianity as well, which I didn't want to outright be a Christian religious studies person. That's different. So I wound up in book publishing. I've been in it for 30 years. I've worked for a couple of major publishing brands. One is Guidepost Magazine, which is something a lot of people's grandmothers know about.
Oh yeah. I remember reading it when I was a kid.
True inspirational stories. It was actually run out in Manhattan, New York City. They had a book division, and what my job working for the book division was to take the names from the large mailing lists that their magazine generated and send them advertisements through the mail, direct advertising, saying, hey, we like this book. We think you'll like it too. And we sold a lot of books that way. And that really got
before email and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. Before email. Right.
Yeah. Direct mail
is kind of their main modus operandi. They send these 6x9 mailings that have these big colorful brochures in them. And they still haven't figured out how to really online sell books like Amazon does, which has affected their business as it's affected all of our business.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I learned a lot about the different, the wide field of more religious publishing, but also the broader market publishing, the big five in New York City in particular. Those like Random House and Harper and Simon & Schuster and Macmillan and so on. I learned about the whole field of publishing because that job also let me like license books from other publishers as well as create them and then repackage them for that audience.
Mm-hmm.
After about 17 years of that, commuting into New York City from New Jersey, where I live with my wife and daughters, I was asked to be the publisher at Zondervan Books.
Ooh, that's big. That's a big name.
It's pretty much the best known evangelical publishing company, book publishing brand. There's arguably one other company that might be seen as bigger from a revenue point of view, but Zondervan is probably the one that's most recognizable. The story so with that, I went from being kind of like a book buyer and repackager and market tester. I wrote a lot of copy for them and for Guideposts when I was there, to being a publisher with some big Christian celebrity cell phone numbers suddenly in my hip pocket, and their agents, and I dealt with the big advance, hundreds of thousands of dollars of advance offers for certain books, maybe even $1 million at times, depending on the book. It was big business, big.
I can imagine.
Distribution, big staff, big infrastructure.
It's a massive company.
Lots and lots of money, lots and lots of capitalism too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good Christian company.
Zondervan was owned by HarperCollins since the 1980s, and everybody knows that. So one of the big five publishers. And then they bought the other really big publisher, Thomas Nelson, the other big evangelical publisher, and this one located in Nashville. And eventually my job just got consolidated, like a lot of jobs in book publishing, where publishers are buying each other up. And my position as publisher of Zondervan got moved to Nashville, believe it or not, which is kind of surprising to hear for people who live in the Midwest and Grand Rapids, and they're into that, that Zondervan vibe more. So I'm out on my own now, and I do, like I said, literary agenting. I've got a select stable of authors that I shepherd over to publishers, and then I have started my own publishing just so that I can, we really need more options to resource people who have shifted away from the religious upbringing that they had. Where do they go? What kinds of information and insights do they need? How do you still sort of nurture that spiritual side of yourself without the same kind of dogma? But really, a lot of it is just processing. How do we understand what's happened to us? These things just don't change overnight. And, there's a lot of really important stories to tell, just so that we can hold ourselves accountable and be aware of, the state of religion as it is in the United States. That's where I am. And you're in the UK, right?
Yeah, we're in northwest of England, North Wales area. I've been here for about 18 years. Going back to something you said, you talked about your sort of metaphor was mourning a loss, leaving your faith behind, leaving your religion behind. And speaking of our friend Janice, her metaphor is a divorce. She calls it divorcing religion. And that's a very similar kind of concept, isn't it? It does feel like you've gone through a very messy and painful divorce, especially if you're the child watching your parents go through all this and you're left with all the fallout of it, the emotional baggage and the loss of everything. And like you said, you've got to then process it all. But were you raised in sort of evangelical Christianity? You sound like you were from the New Jersey area originally. Were you raised in church and all that from day one?
Yeah, I was. I was a pastor's kid. Actually lived in Southern California growing up, born in Indiana, where my dad was going to a conservative Christian college, or rather seminary.
It wasn't Wheaton, was it?
No.
Well, that's in Illinois.
There's a small denomination called Grace Brethren Church, and there's a seminary called Grace Seminary in Tucson, Indiana. Do I have that right? I think so, or somewhere around there.
Yeah, it's in the Midwest.
History for me personally.
Yeah, like long time ago.
Yeah, Southern California, Northern Virginia, and New Jersey.
You bounced around a fair bit.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that we all kind of get different doses of it.
Mm-hmm.
I've met enough people now to know I got a relatively mild dose even though it was still very, very all-encompassing, defined very much who I am. You know, I think there's a tendency, and I've seen evidence of this, for people to think that those who are raised in a high commitment, all-encompassing evangelical background, and you know, and how do you define that? Well, maybe, you know, you listen to Christian radio and Christian music all the time, and you went to church a whole bunch of times a week, and you read the Bible, you know, constantly, which is not an exaggeration for
that's pretty much what I did.
Yeah, and I have my dose of that as well, my involvement of that as well with that. And I would there's some that tend to say that is like an extreme experience. You know, the evangelical focus on, you know, high prioritizing of Scripture to define everything. The belief in the bodily resurrection of Christ and being the only way, the exclusivity to salvation, however that's defined, and the other aspects to evangelicalism. But I find that attitude is far more pervasive, almost in a folk religion way, throughout different denominations, mainline as well as evangelical, non-denominational as well as denominational. There's still this sort of let's just talk about God, and it's like a supernatural belief in a God is very much shaped by our social location in the United States. And you might say, you know, well, it's different here or different there, or, you know, there's Lutherans, and then there's Methodists, there's Episcopalians, and there's
Baptists. You could so many different denominations.
Baptists, but they're far more alike than people want to admit. And I don't know, I can get going on this stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's the sociological aspect of it, isn't it? Yeah, it's funny because if you were raised in a different country, there's a good chance you're probably going to adopt the dominant religion of that country. You know, if you're raised in India, you're going to be a Hindu or a Muslim, or if you're raised in China, you're probably going to be a Buddhist or something like that. You know, here we are, like you said, raised in America. Both of us, we were raised in good Christian families, so we became Christian. What's the chances of that? You know, it's the sociological aspect, isn't it? We tend to adopt the dominant religion of our community, our nation.
Right. Yeah.
But you were lucky in that sense that you weren't like in a fundamentalist, like independent fundamental Baptist or anything like that.
Right. It didn't necessarily shape the kind of clothes I had to wear.
The strict controls.
Yeah. I wouldn't say even in my own home life that we were highly observant in terms of like doing devotionals after dinner or before dinner every day. But there was some intriguing aspects to it that I realized, hey, not everybody was raised this way. And I you know, once I was in the larger world, and one of my best friends growing up in high school was Jewish, it's like, okay, this is interesting. You weren't raised the way you're and then
different.
I married someone who was raised Catholic, and it's like, it's a totally different world, a totally different language. How could these different worlds even exist?
Somehow we're both Christians, but it's not the same, is it?
Yeah.
And Jews are ostensibly worshiping the same God as Christians, they would say, but it's so different, isn't it? It's
just all of the attitudes and the value systems. You know, there can be quite a bit of difference. Yeah, I mean, just from a Catholic point of view, you know, the way Protestants and evangelicals in particular make the Bible such a priority, for her it was more about liturgy. And, you know, to this day, she's like remarking to me how there's extra books in the Catholic Bible versus the Protestant Bible. And she's been used to the Protestant Bible in more recent times.
Right.
And she's forgotten that, that's
apocryphal literature.
I want to read that. Why is that in there, you know?
How come that's not in the evangelical Bible?
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
To the evangelical Bible as the Bible. I'm like, but that's not necessarily true. That's what evangelicals want you to think.
Yeah. That's a whole nother debate, isn't it? Well, and then it's interesting. Like we were talking about sociology. If you compare fundamentalist Islam, Judaism, and Christianity at their core, they're very, very similar. You know, so that's another element of this thing, isn't that? What these Abrahamic religions are deeply patriarchal, and the way they treat their followers is almost remarkably consistent across those three religions. So, you know, it's you think, oh, we're different than the Muslims and the Jews, but Not really. If you push it to the logical conclusion, it's very similar, isn't it?
Yeah, especially when you look at the political whole of these things.
Yeah.
A fundamentalist Muslim does not look very different from a fundamentalist Christian.
That's true.
In terms of their ethics, the way they treat people,
treat women.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you're sitting in America. Are you still in the New Jersey area? Did you say? Is that where you're living currently?
With my publishing job, I moved to Grand Rapids.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. So you're sitting in the middle of this context. What are you seeing from the sort of Trump evangelical Christian right thing? Because that's something I've done a lot of research and talking to other people about. What does that do to you? Did that have any effect on your deconstruction, or was it a completely different element of sort of theological thing or your relationship with the church? How did it come about?
I would say that definitely, like most people, it accelerated my own journey. When I saw just how surprised I was that, a culture that raised me to love others as I would want to be loved, to not judge unless I want to be judged, to how they've so easily set aside their values to vote for someone who on paper is promising them the kinds of cultural victories that they want out of politics, rather than actual policies of, governance. And that was really disillusioning for me, like everyone else. I would say, though, for me, I think it's the expansion and changing attitudes toward the queer community in the culture at large that also had its effect on me, that I woke up more as well. I think I've always been affirming, but I realized I worked for an employer who really wasn't.
Right.
From a practical standpoint, even though there was no official statement about it. And then, it came to a point where there was a retired pastor in the church, the evangelical church my wife and I were attending, and his son asked to officiate at his son's same-sex marriage. And the denomination kicked this guy out.
Wow.
And they asked him not to preach in their churches anymore.
He was banned. Yeah.
His life, his blood, sweat, and tears to this denomination and to the local church. And he's one of these older people that you get to know them a little bit. And you're like, boy, I would love to just spend more time with this person. This kind, gentle human being, smart, articulate, not perfect, but that's how all of us humans are. And to see that happen, and to see someone like well into their 70s, see he and his wife be annoyed, if not downright angry and indignant, in a time of your life where you're supposed to be looking back and
reflecting. You got kicked to the curb for sure.
And in that time in your life to be kicked to the curb, wow. I just thought, okay, this is just outright a moral wrong. And that's all, and that's exactly what it is. And it's a practice of bigotry in what is probably a more centrist evangelical denomination, which I'll leave nameless for the moment. But
it's not even a fundamentalist outfit.
No, it wasn't even super fundamentalist, and yet they won't affirm same-sex marriages. They're probably very nervous about having a queer person lead a Sunday school class.
Oh yeah,
right. So that was just like, that's enough. I can't condone this. I can't be part of it. I'm not going to try to change it from the inside. I'm going to vote with my feet, and I'm going to find my own spiritual path elsewhere. Because I will tell you, and this even kind of gets back, what really surprised me about that experience more than anything else was I actually have a PhD in studying religion and loss of faith.
Yeah, this is right in their wheelhouse.
Here I was, me and my wife, experiencing it all over again. That whole living feeling of like, oh, I've given up on this community. I'm the horrible person, or maybe I've thought this through wrong, or, I don't know. Like, now I don't have community. What do I do? And I thought I had figured it out, but I hadn't.
It's a lot of work, isn't it? Well, going back to your comment about the inclusive, I remember a couple of years ago, I was in Portland visiting friends, and I was chatting with a guy that actually used to be my associate pastor when I was working at a church in Portland. And we were talking about that whole subject of, our churches in Portland. It's a little bit more of a liberal city. Are they inclusive? And he said the thing is, he's found as he's gone from church to church, they'll say they're inclusive, meaning, but what it's disingenuous, because what they mean is, we'll welcome you if you're gay. We won't judge you. However, our secret agenda is we're going to pray for you that God will A, save you, and B, make you straight. So they won't discriminate against you. And in that sense, they think they're being inclusive, but it really isn't. They won't kick you out. But if you ask, like you said, to be the worship leader or to be running a Sunday school or to preach a sermon, probably not, so it's a little bit disingenuous on that level.
Yeah. And those things are to lean on Catholic and liturgical traditions. Those things, being able to teach, being able to lead worship, getting married, those are spiritual sacraments.
Yes.
And those churches will raise someone who is same-sex attracted or has different sexuality than the accepted binary norms and gender definitions. They'll raise someone like that from a kid from the early age, and then deny them those things as they become adults. And that's just spiritually and psychologically and emotionally, that's egregious behavior.
Yeah, it's abusive. When we come back in just a few minutes in the second half of this conversation with David, the former Christian publisher, we're going to get into conversion therapy, his views on Trumpism and the whole MAGA evangelical movement, and more. So stay tuned for that, just coming up in a few minutes. I just wanted to let you know here on the break what's coming up in the next few episodes here on the show. We've got a fantastic interview lined up for you with my very good friend Tim Sledge. He, like me, is an ex-evangelical pastor out of Texas. We had a fantastic conversation the other day about his really excellent book, 4 Disturbing Questions with One Simple Answer, Breaking the Spell of Christian Belief. And I read that book just off the back of finishing my book. I'm like 99.9% finished with my book, and Tim's actually helping me edit it, and he's going to publicize it once it gets out. And I'm hoping it drops sometime, maybe October, even maybe November. It's taken a bit longer than I thought. I was hoping it was going to get out in September, but it's looking like I want to get it right before it goes out. So I'll let you know. But anyway, Tim and I had a good conversation about that because there's a lot of resonance between my story, getting baptized 3 times, growing up in the Evangelical Church of Christ. So once I read his book, I really, really wanted to chat with him. So that's coming up next. Then I had an absolutely just a fantastic conversation with another person I've just met, Catherine North. She's living up in Canada, and she's written a book called Holy Heathen. She's got just an unbelievable story. She grew up as a missionary kid in Japan, and she was raised in this deeply fundamentalist context as a missionary kid, and all the rest of it, she's come out of the faith. We had just a fantastic conversation. So that's coming up after my chat with Tim Sledge. And then I'm still working on getting another good friend of mine, another ex-pastor, David Hayward, the Naked Pastor. He's been very busy sort of coming off the summer into the fall or autumn season, but we're going to line up an interview with David Hayward. I need to catch up with him. It's been a long time since I've had him on the show, so that's coming up. And then actually we've got David coming back, David Morris, that is, for our October MindShift Zoom call. We had one a couple weeks ago with Rachel and Molly from the Cheers to Leaving podcast, and that was just a great conversation with those two ladies. But then we've got, as I say, David Morris coming up on the 29th of October, and then we've got Catherine North coming back in November. So I've got a couple of really good MindShift Zoom calls lined up the last couple months of the year before we take a break for the holidays. These are great benefits that you get for being a Patreon supporter of the show. In fact, thanks again to Jim and Flo. These are the authors of Holy Terror, and in fact, they're working on a Holy Terror 2, so I'm hoping to get in touch with them and find out what their updated research is. But thanks to Jim and Flo for renewing their membership of the show. So I greatly appreciate all the supporters we have on Patreon. So let's get on back into the second half of this chat with David Morris as we continue the confessions of a former Christian publisher. The other extreme is, of course, the conversion therapy. That's another aspect of this whole conversation, isn't it? That there are some denominations, some churches that will insist that, okay, you could be celibate, you can have same-sex attraction, but you better not act on it. And in fact, you need to go to conversion therapy.
Yeah, which is proven to be damaging.
Oh yeah, it actually doesn't work. Even though the sort of high-profile ones that have said, "I'm straight now, and I've gotten married to a woman or a man," then a few years later they'll come out and say, "No, I'm still attracted to the same sex." So
right,
it's true. It doesn't actually work.
Doesn't fit the science.
Yeah, it just doesn't work. But it sounds so good if you're saying, well, God couldn't have made you gay. You must have chosen to be gay. You have to be, because my daughter, she's gay. And we went through that whole thing when she came out because my now ex-wife, her family was quite religious. And that was the thing, well, was she abused as a child? Was that what happened? And it turned her gay,
Oh my.
No,
Yeah.
She was always that way. When she came out, we were like, okay, we've known for years. We were just waiting for you to, pick the time when you wanted to tell us. But we've known for years. It's not a shock to us at all.
Right. And that's the challenge with evangelicalism and fundamentalist conservative religious stance is you're not willing to look at the facts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, staring you in the face sometimes. You're not willing to look at humanity, look at human life,
mm-hmm.
that does have gender and sexual differences that don't fit into neat categories.
Yeah, it's true. Well, what do you think about this whole, we kind of alluded to it, you mentioned, these evangelicals, they voted for Trump. As I interpreted it, and I see it now, my take on it was, like you said, they set aside their sort of ideals to vote for this guy who on paper was the antithesis of everything they claimed to stand for, because he was going to help them achieve that dominion, like you said, the political agenda. And in some ways, they won. They got 3 Supreme Court justices appointed. They overturned Roe versus Wade. Now they're taking aim at LGBTQ rights. That's their agenda. What's your take on it now?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm a super expert in this from a sociological point of view, mm-hmm. or an ethics point of view, or even a theology point of view. A lot of the conversation absolutely is that, it's more of a race and class conversation, more focused on race than anything.
Mm-hmm. White Christian nationalism.
Christian nationalism, which to me describes a group that is accustomed to a dominant culture in the United States.
They don't want it to change,
and they don't, and yet there's more diversity now more than ever. Finally, those who are considered in the classification of white are actually no longer a majority. That changed in recent years. That's a real thing. So that's from a psychological point of view and a conscious point of view, that's threatening. That's scary. To know that you're going to have to welcome people with different backgrounds, different skin colors, different languages into this country, which actually draws its strength from democracy and diversity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, different religions as well.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I think a lot of it is fear-based. A lot of it is some of the very strange poverty, I think, that goes on in the United States. In particular, there's quite a divide between rural America and urban America. And, you might have a state like Texas that you think is really super conservative, and certainly by the talk from their governor, they are.
It's a red state,
but look at how Houston voted. Look how Dallas voted. It's blue.
You've got pockets of blue in the midst of the red.
Yeah, and I think too, there's been a big shift to there's a new kind of elite rich person, probably best summed up in types like Elon Musk. Now he tends to be more conservative, but if you think of a lot of the Silicon Valley types and all the money involved there, it tends to be more liberal. And I think a lot of those who are voting for Trump are super frustrated that their way of life has changed. And even the old school Republicans who used to be the sort of money power elite, they no longer have that either. So it's kind of weird. People who used to be Democrat, like the working class, are now voting Republican.
Yeah, there's been a
and you have
massive
more
paradigm
educated,
shift.
technologically savvy, more new rich elite voting Democrat. So I think it's just it's very much it's not just a race issue, it's a class issue, it's how wealth is distributed issue. And I think I sometimes wish that we would look at it as well from a class point of view, at least more so than we have, simply because that's really, one of the biggest questions. I mean, even where I am here in Grand Rapids, I wound up being a white guy working for a well-known publisher in a relatively affluent white neighborhood.
Yeah. What are the odds?
It doesn't, and Grand Rapids is such a size that it only takes me, minutes to cross over this one street where suddenly it's a very, very different world. And the differences are really quite shocking, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
They're quite striking. And I live actually not far from where Betsy DeVos lives.
Oh,
and
you BFFs with Betsy?
No. I mean, that's just, she's got her own compound with a gate and a camera,
mega billionaire, isn't she? Yeah.
Yeah.
You're not getting invited to her tea parties, I suppose, David.
No. Pool parties is more like it. They've got people over there. They also have a helicopter, and I've never ridden.
Oh, of course they do. Yeah. Big Amway fortune. Speaking of wacky thoughts,
I'm 2 miles away from where the Amway headquarters in Ada, Michigan.
Oh.
But it's just striking to me how, the money that they have, the things that they could do to flip things over with regard to the poverty that's just minutes away from their front door. The money that I've seen them invest in certain kinds of things, and I think, man, you could have bought like 5 blocks of more affordable and more modernized housing and given educational opportunities for hundreds of people. And who am I to sort of judge all their charitable work? But it's pretty clear that, like a lot of evangelicals, we'd much rather invest in saving souls in Africa than tending to our own neighbors who were descendants of those from Africa, right in our own neighborhoods.
Well, yeah, and like you say, you look at the dark money that flows into some of these Christian right organizations. I mean, the DeVos family, the Ulines, the Greens who own Hobby Lobby, and of course the Museum of the Bible, they're giving to untold millions into organizations like Moms for Liberty. I mean, going back to what you were saying about wanting to keep things the way they are. I mean, this is a big agenda that I've been seeing over here, and that is this drive to ban books in public libraries. And that's a massive hot topic right now, isn't it? And so people like the DeVos family and others are funding these sort of drive. That's what they're putting their money into, is these Christian right organizations that are trying to ban books from libraries.
And it's funny. I actually know I've actually, you mentioned, I've actually met people who have a lot of money, and they're not necessarily, and who are giving a lot of money to charities like this, they're not necessarily theologians themselves. They don't necessarily understand, what it is they're giving money to, or how to make their decisions. They're actually people with just a lot of money that they don't know what to do with, which is another thing too. It's sort of like, why are CEOs paid so much money? It's like, that's just, there's nobody should be paid that much money. Nobody should make that much.
Hundreds of times what the average employee in their companies makes, isn't it? Just ludicrous.
Yeah. I'm not even speaking like from a particular, economic philosophy right now. I'm just speaking from everyday experience. I've been in the corporate world enough, and I've seen the paychecks that I got and that some of my supervisors got. And I thought, what do you even do with all that money? You don't need it all to live.
Do you really need it?
Yeah.
Especially going along with the teachings of Jesus, about don't worry about your daily bread and all that. God will provide for you. It's like a vow of poverty sort of thing.
Yeah. And something about just giving it away is not a good enough rationalization.
Yeah. Sell everything you have, give it to the poor.
Well, what I mean is,
no one's doing that.
If you're that rich, but you justify it by saying, why I support these amazing foundations and so on, and that work wouldn't go on if I wasn't funding it. I don't know if that's a full enough explanation.
Yeah, but it's good on paper.
Yeah. I I understand that money, people will get windfalls, there will be a lot of money involved sometimes. And then what do you do with that money? Okay, I get it. But the way we've routinized and standardized, even like CEO pay in the United States, or even whatever, people who are really high paid, that's the part that just still kind of just from a very ground level, I had employees in publishing, and I saw how much money they made, and I saw what their home life was like, and the quality of the cars they drove, and the neighborhoods they were able to live in. And I just thought, and then I see who some of the executives above me were. This is just really weird. Why is this so different? And we're
huge inequality. Yeah, exactly. A Christian company, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Surely they should be different, living different. It's ironic. I was just doing a podcast with a good friend of mine, David Johnson, last night. We got to talking about, because earlier you said exercising my ability. So I almost thought you were going to say exercising my spiritual gifts. Because as evangelicals, we would have said that. And we did a whole podcast on spiritual gifts, and we kind of broke down a sermon on YouTube, and we sort of deconstructed it. And I was saying that it's ironic that at the church I was pastor of in Portland, we were actually the last 2 or 3 years trying to live consistent with how I read passages like Ephesians 4 and some of the other ones, we're helping people raise up their spiritual gifts and working myself out of a job. That church ended up closing down. And I was dumbfounded by the fact that at the end of it all, I said, but don't you guys realize we were trying to live according to the Bible's teachings, and you didn't like it. We had to close the church down. So even in that example, Christians aren't necessarily trying to really be consistent with what the pretty clear teachings of Scripture actually say.
Right. Yeah.
Hugely ironic.
Yeah, it is hugely ironic.
Yep.
I mean, if I could sort of pause and step back for a minute, one of the things I've spent a lot of time thinking about lately is just why we are so obsessed with religion in the United States in particular. One of the holes in my own education was history of religion, history of Christianity, and for that matter. And I just read sort of like a primer book on the history of American Protestantism, and it talked about how we were a country where so many of our ancestors, white ancestors, were people who were leaving European countries because our ancestors felt as though there wasn't religious freedom, that they couldn't practice their faith, possibly because of state-controlled religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, persecution and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, the marriage of the crown and the pulpit in European countries.
Mm-hmm.
And so, from the very beginning, the cultural DNA in the United States has been a group of religious rebels.
Yeah, it's true.
We were founded in a way by fundamentalists who wanted to practice a certain way. They wanted a theocracy, you might say. But that was also mixed in with the promise of being in a new land with new resources and new opportunities for economic growth. I think that was part of the promise as well.
Sure.
And then you mix in slavery with that, and it's just like, from an emotional, psychological point of view, the threads that we got started 400 plus years ago in North America, they are going to take a long time to continue to unravel. I'm just so fascinated by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, for example.
Yeah, it's a good case study, isn't it? It really is.
Yeah.
The fascinating one.
And there was Anne Hutchinson on one side, she's a woman, and then there was the Massachusetts Bay Colony governor, and I'm going to get his name mixed up with someone else.
Was it Winthrop?
Winthrop, thank you.
John Winthrop.
Yeah, good.
And I got a gold star for my history test.
Winthrop is someone who's like, okay, let's go create this city on a hill in New England, and be closer to God, so to speak. Get away from the controlling governmental religion of Europe. And then Anne Hutchinson comes along, and she's leading prayer meetings, grassroots prayer meetings in her home, and subverting his authority. And she's called to a sort of a tribunal where she's stripped of her role in the community and asked to leave, I believe.
Yeah, she was banished.
Yeah,
but who is to say that what she was doing wasn't right?
Right.
Like you say, there's no controls then. If you leave the hegemony of European state-sponsored church, that's the very thing they were arguing, isn't it?
That's an aspect of it as well.
Yeah. we don't.
The very thing that Winthrop was trying to get away from in Europe, he was now
duplicating it. Yeah.
In North
Same
America.
model. Yeah.
But in this case, now you've got this particularly hot mix of self-made religious people, like even Ann Hutchinson, for that matter. I'm not gonna try to question her theology or her connection to the divine, but it's very self-made, which is exactly what George Winthrop wanted. And so now you have this like strange dichotomy that continues in the United States about everybody's arguing about what religious institutions ought to be. Hence, you have so much church splitting, so many denominations, so many startup churches that have no accountability. It's just this strange free market capitalistic Christianity in the United States. And that's what we're trying to detach ourselves from psychologically. I'll add one last thing to that. We've almost needed a rigid religious life here because we don't have the weight of history, because we left our homeland, so to speak.
We disconnected.
We disconnected ourselves. So that rigid religion oppressing others, it's just been, I'm not excusing it in any way. I'm just trying to say that's been, that's our legacy, and that's what we have to undo.
It's true, yeah. If you were a Catholic up until probably the time of the Reformation, one thing you could count on in Europe is that the church had that hegemony. So every quote unquote heresy, they could literally stamp it out, and they did. They just ruthlessly stamped it out. So they had that measure of control. They controlled the Bible. They had the Latin Vulgate. They had literally armies at their disposal, so they could go in and wipe out the Cathars and other so-called heresies. Whereas, like you say, in America, you couldn't do that. So who's to say that Joseph Smith wasn't right, or Ann Hutchinson, or L. Ron Hubbard, or any other cult religion, whatever that was a homegrown American thing, Mary Baker Eddy, any number of them. There's no control. Like you say, it reminds me of Kurt Anderson's book Fantasyland. I don't know if you've read that, but that's basically his argument, isn't it? That we've created a fantasy land where anything goes, and there's no controls. So you can't sit back and complain that it's wrong or heretical. I'm just exercising my freedom, the very freedoms you fought for. How ironic.
But to be a normal religious person, normal spiritual person, where you are in England, you guys have left a lot of that back, put a lot of it aside. I'm not saying there isn't issues, and there's certainly.
Oh yeah, we do have some.
Yeah, but there's, you're part of secular Europe.
Yeah, the church doesn't really have a presence, nothing like what it is in America. Certainly not involved in politics.
But from a psychological, emotional point of view, is that healthier or unhealthy?
I think it's far healthier than it is in America.
Yeah.
There's a very small minority of evangelicals that try to get involved in parliament and things, but it's nothing like the Christian right in America. You just don't hear it. The Archbishop of Canterbury might make a speech and it might get on the news or something about some topic, but it's nothing like, if it was a Billy Graham type of figure or someone like that in America.
Right. Where you have Paula White being summoned to the White House. And,
he
kinds of political.
Exactly. He's not getting summoned to meet with King Charles, and before that, Queen Elizabeth. I mean, they might talk, but that's changed massively.
I think that's part of our hope. I mean, is how does America move toward a less religiously charged country, less religiously charged identity is really what it is.
Yeah. Can it be done?
It doesn't mean you can't be spiritual. It doesn't mean you can't be Christian even. It just means that you find other ways of defining who you are and not caught up in a literal, that require you to do things like read the Bible in a literal way and a self-contradictory way for that matter.
Yeah. It's true. Well, the good thing is I've seen these polls, it seems like in America, as in other countries like Australia, like you say, Great Britain, Europe, as the number of Christians declines, at the same time, there's another track that's going up, the nuns, as you said before. So the Christianity seems to be in decline numerically in some places, whereas the new generation that's coming on is less likely to have those religious ideals and beliefs. So I do hold out hope for the next couple of generations.
Yeah. I would even say that sort of, the change is happening. I think it's I think structurally it's happening in the United States faster than people realize, much of it brought on by the rise of the digital marketplace. We are all far more segmented than we ever used to be, which also allows for a lot of independence and allows for a lot of craziness at times. But there isn't like this mass culture that we all need to participate in. And I think that's allowed people's identities to come out more. So there's a certain freedom in that. I think it has to be, and I think we kind of have to get to work on this stuff. Where I used to work in religious publishing, the author Brian McLaren has called it the Christian industrial complex. I don't know if he coined that phrase or not, but I worked for the Christian industrial complex. I worked for a company that was well over $300 million in publishing. The unit I ran was a significant portion of that. The amount of resources, the infrastructure there. It's why people at a Methodist church might be doing a Beth Moore Bible study. Very different traditions, Beth Moore and Methodists, in many definitions. But because Beth Moore gets better marketed, better distribution, bigger print runs, that's bigger name. That's what you have. But the world is changing in such a way that that's not working as well as it used to. And those companies are not doing as well as they used to. Even publishers in general, Christian or not, their business is not as easy as it once was. So I think I hold out a lot of hope that, continued innovation and change it creates at least pockets of opportunity for us to start living in the world in different ways. And we've got to get to work because, goodness, what's happening with our planet, what's happening even with things like hate crime being on the rise. We've got to solve some of these things culturally, and we've got to make some progress, and we've got to start talking to one another.
It's true. I'm glad we've connected. I'm just looking at the time. I know you've got stuff to do. I do appreciate chatting with you. And I know from what we talked about before we hit record, the kind of books that you're looking to publish and you are publishing, they are helping people, as you said, to connect with that sort of community of ex-evangelicals. So you're doing the right thing for sure. So how can people find you if they wanted to get a hold of you on social media? What's the best place to do it?
Yeah, thank you. Just go to my publishing website, lakedrivebooks.com, lakedrivebooks.com. It's also at Lake Drive Books on any social media platform, or most of them. And check out the books there. You can learn more about me there when you click on the About page and my literary agenting work. And definitely, though, check out the authors. Got some amazing books that are coming out, amazing stories that need to be told, and having a blast. It's hard work, but I'm having a blast.
Hard work, but worth it. I was just going to say, before I let you go, if you're interested, I'd love to continue the conversation. Once a month, we do what I call a MindShift Zoom call with a group of people. And we've got an open slot in October and November. If you're interested in coming back on and being a guest, I would love to have you. We've got the last Sunday of October and then the last Sunday of November. So I might be able to shoot you some dates. If you're interested in coming back, I'd love to have a chat with a group of people.
Yeah, sure. Tell me more about it. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll send you some emails, send you some information, and hopefully we can maybe connect up again, and I'll have you meet some of the people in our closed group, and we just have a great conversation for about an hour on the last Sunday of the month. So it's really good.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, David. I've really enjoyed meeting you. And again, thank you to Janice Selbie for introducing us, and I'm sure we'll touch base again.
Sounds good. Thank you. Great to be here.